Have you ever felt the chilling certainty that the tools you've been given are designed to fail? That the official story is a lie, and that the lives of your friends rest on a truth only you can see? For one man, this wasn't a feeling. It was a greasy mechanical reality, written in spilled hydraulic fluid and the ghosts of 17 fallen pilots. This is the story of a simple piece of wire that defied an empire, and the quiet mechanic who dared to use it. The air at 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, hung thick and wet over WWII airfield, a swampy, hard-won patch of earth in New Guinea. It tasted of gasoline and dread. Crouched under the gleaming aluminum wing of a P-38 Lightning, Technical Sergeant James McKenna watched his pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, go through the motions of preparing for a mission that was, in all likelihood, a death sentence. Hayes was just 23, a kid from Iowa with the faint traces of farm dust still in his soul. 6 combat missions etched in his flight log, and not a single kill to his name. Today, he was being sent up as bait. Intelligence had reported 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros inbound, the ghosts of the Pacific, sent to sweep the morning patrol from the sky. Hayes would be flying straight into their serrated embrace. McKenna, a quiet man from Long Beach, had been the heart and soul of these P-38s for 8 grueling months. He knew them more intimately than a lover knows their partner's breath. A twin-engine, twin-boom marvel of engineering. A predator that was terrifyingly fast in a straight line, an absolute beast at high altitude. But the P-38, this beautiful, deadly machine, had a secret, a fatal flaw. A flaw that was sending American boys home in boxes, day after agonizing day. It couldn't turn with a zero. The zero was a phantom, a whisper on the wind. Lighter, impossibly agile, it could carve a full, horizontal turn in the sky in half the time a P-38 needed. In a swirling dogfight, a ballet of death thousands of feet above the jungle canopy, that difference wasn't just a disadvantage. It was a final, unmerciful judgment. The doctrine, the Bible handed down from on high, was clear. Never turn with a zero. Use your speed. Use your altitude. Dive in, shoot, and climb out. Hit and run. But never, ever get caught in their deadly, spiraling dance. Hayes had tried. 5 times he had followed the book, and 5 times the Zeros had been smarter. They were cunning hunters. They would bait the heavy American fighters into turns, cut inside their wide, predictable radius, latch onto their tails like wolves, and tear them from the sky. The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in 6 weeks. A cemetery of aluminum and young men. Most of them shot down after being lured into turning engagements they could not escape. McKenna had watched too many good men die. McKenna had seen their faces, still flushed with the confidence of youth, as they climbed into cockpits he had personally signed off on. He saw them come back shredded, or not at all. The training manuals, written by men thousands of miles away in sterile offices, blamed pilot error. The instructors, with their crisp uniforms and detached analysis, said these pilots weren't following doctrine. But McKenna, his hands perpetually stained with the grease and lifeblood of these machines, knew better. The problem wasn't the men. It was the machine. It was the control cables. The P-38's aileron controls were a complex web of cables running through the long twin booms to the tail, then back forward through a series of pulleys to the wing surfaces. And in that system, there was slack, a tiny, almost imperceptible amount, maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection, a flaw deemed within factory tolerances. At high speeds, in a screaming dive, it meant nothing, but at lower speeds, in the chaos of a hard-turning fight, That fraction of an inch created a fraction of a second of delay, a lag between the pilot's desperate stick movement and the aileron's actual response. It was the length of a heartbeat. It was the difference between life and death. McKenna had pointed this out to the engineering officer 2 months prior. The officer, a man who lived by the book, had dismissed him. "The cable tension is within specifications, Sergeant." A voided warranty on a multi-thousand-dollar aircraft was a greater sin than a dead pilot. Besides, a field mechanic had no authority to modify flight control systems. That required approval from Lockheed, and Lockheed was 7,000 miles and an ocean away in sunny California. So, on this humid, fateful morning, McKenna did something that was a direct violation of every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. He took a 6-inch piece of piano wire, scavenged from a wrecked plane, bent it into a precise Z shape, and, with his heart hammering against his ribs, installed it as a crude, homemade tensioner on Lieutenant Hayes's left aileron control cable. The entire career-ending modification took 8 minutes. It added a mere 1.4 pounds of tension. It eliminated the slack completely. The morning inspection crew, focused on fuel levels and ammo counts, noticed nothing. McKenna said nothing. He simply stood back, a ghost in grease-stained coveralls, and watched. He watched Hayes taxi to the runway, a lone gladiator. He watched the P-38's twin engines roar to life, kicking up dust and the smell of ozone. He watched it lift into the hazy morning sky, disappearing toward the swarm of waiting Japanese fighters. What would happen in the next 17 minutes wouldn't just decide the fate of one young pilot. It would rewrite the rules of aerial combat for every P-38 in the Pacific. The first pilot McKenna lost to a zero was a kid named Lieutenant David Chen. July 9, 1943. Chen had been in theater for just 3 weeks, still carrying the bright, optimistic shine of California. McKenna had worked on his bird every morning. They'd talk about home. Chen was from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. They'd both been gearheads before the war, tinkering with cars. It was a small, fragile bond in a world designed to break them. On that final morning, Chen took off at 06:15 for a fighter sweep. He came back 2 hours later, his P-38 limping, 3 neat 20mm holes punched through his left boom. His story was a chilling echo of so many others. A zero had gotten inside his turn. Chen said he'd tried to roll out and dive away, just like the manual said, but the plane felt sluggish. "Like I was moving the stick through molasses," he'd recounted, his voice still shaking. "There was a delay, just a split second, but he was almost on me." Only his wingman's desperate pass had saved him, blasting the zero off his tail. McKenna stared at the bullet holes. They were a tight, clinical group, perfect deflection shooting. The Japanese pilot had anticipated Chen's move perfectly. That shouldn't have been possible if Chen had reacted instantly. Unless the airplane had hesitated just long enough for the enemy to get the lead right. Chen never flew again. 3 weeks later, the news filtered back. Killed over Rabaul in a different P-38. Same story. Caught in a turn he couldn't escape. Then came Captain William Morrison, a flight leader, an ace with 11 kills. He was no green kid. He was a seasoned veteran who knew the P-38's weaknesses and flew around them. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight tangled with 8 zeros over Oro Bay. Morrison nailed one on the first pass, but as he came around, 2 zeros reversed on him. McKenna, listening to the crackling radio traffic back at base, heard Morrison's voice, tight with strain, call out that his controls felt mushy. He tried to roll inverted and split S away, a classic escape maneuver. The zeros stayed glued to him, their guns chattering. Morrison went down at 4,000 feet. His wingman, voice cracking, said it looked like the plane just wasn't responding. Morrison's crew chief, Rodriguez, a friend of McKenna's, was inconsolable. He was convinced something was wrong with the aircraft. He crawled over the wreckage himself. Every setting, every cable tension, within spec. The official report landed with a thud. Pilot error. Rodriguez didn't believe it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had worked on the planes of 17 dead men. 17. The names and faces blurred into a single haunting specter of loss. The survivors who limped back all told the same tale. A lag, a slight hesitation in hard maneuvers. Most wrote it off as the nature of the beast, a heavy fighter just being heavy. But McKenna knew. He had felt that slack with his own hands during maintenance. He started listening. He developed an ear for the sound the cables made when he plucked them. A specific low twang. He could hear the difference between a truly tight cable and one that was merely within spec. Every single P-38 on the line sounded slightly loose. After Morrison died, he told Rodriguez. "What can we do?" Rodriguez had asked, his voice hollow. McKenna looked out across the airfield at the rows of waiting aircraft. "Nothing official," he'd said, the words heavy with consequence. "But unofficially, there might be a solution. It just requires breaking regulations that could get us both court-martialed." The problem wasn't ignorance. The pilots knew the doctrine. It was hammered into them in every briefing, drilled into their muscle memory in every training flight. Never turn with a zero. It was the first commandment of P-38 survival. The problem was that the swirling chaos of combat has no respect for commandments. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the farm kid from Iowa, was a living testament to that. He'd followed the rules religiously, and the rules were getting him killed. On his third mission, he did everything by the book. Dove on a lone zero from altitude, the sun at his back, building up a screaming 400 mph of speed. He got the zero in his gun sight, a perfect textbook setup. As he began to pull lead for the shot, the zero simply snap-rolled and dove. Hayes tried to follow, jamming the stick over. His P-38 lumbered into the roll, feeling like it was fighting him, like it was moving through a wall of unseen mud. By the time his guns were pointing where the zero had been, there was only empty sky. His fourth mission was worse. He and his wingman jumped 2 zeros. Hayes fired, missed. The zero reversed hard right. As Hayes rolled to follow, his wingman's voice crackled in his ears, sharp with alarm. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high!" 2 more zeros were screaming so down on them. Hayes tried to roll back level and dive to escape. The plane responded, but slowly. Just slowly enough for one of the diving zeros to stitch a 3-second burst of 20mm cannon shells across his right boom. The shells didn't penetrate the tough airframe, but they ripped into Hayes's confidence, leaving him shaken and running for home with his engines trailing smoke. Then came the 5th mission, the one that broke him, the one where he watched his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, die. Parker was 21 from Boston. They'd come through training together. Over Finschhafen, Parker got separated. 2 zeros latched onto his tail. Hayes, helpless, listened on the radio. He heard Parker try everything. Hard rolls, reversals, desperate scissoring maneuvers. The zeros stayed with him, toying with him. He heard the rising panic in Parker's voice. He heard him scream, "She won't turn! God, she won't turn fast enough!" He heard the sickening rattle of cannon fire. He heard a final, choked scream. Then, silence. That night, sleep was a luxury no one in the squadron could afford. Parker's bunk remained starkly empty, a monument to a life extinguished. His belongings were packed. His P-38 was written off. The maintenance log, cold and impartial, noted no mechanical issues. Official cause of death: pilot error. McKenna had worked on Parker's plane that very morning. Cable tension within spec. The aircraft was fine. But Parker was dead. And McKenna knew, with a certainty that burned in his gut, that the tiny, acceptable slack in the controls had killed him. The worst part for McKenna was the smell. Every morning the pre-dawn air was thick with it. The sharp tang of aviation fuel, the hot metallic scent of engines, the oily perfume of hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of war. The smell of machines preparing to either kill or be killed. On the evening of August 16th, a shadow fell over McKenna as he worked. It was Hayes. The young pilot's face was a mask of fear and exhaustion. He didn't beat around the bush. "Is there anything," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "anything at all you can do to make her roll faster? I don't care if it's regulation. I just want a chance." McKenna looked at the kid. He saw the hollow-eyed terror of a man who knew his number was up. He saw the desperation of someone being sent to his execution. He saw himself. "Come back in the morning," McKenna said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll see what I can do." McKenna worked alone that night. After 2,300 hours, the maintenance hangar fell into a cathedral-like silence, broken only by the distant thrum of generators and the suicidal buzz of insects flinging themselves against the hot overhead lights. The air, heavy with tropical humidity, smelled of cold engine oil and stale sweat. He pulled the inspection panel from the left boom of Hayes's P-38. The aluminum skin was still warm from the day's unforgiving sun. Inside, the aileron control cable snaked through its path of pulleys. McKenna reached in, his fingers, calloused and knowing, wrapping around the cable. He pulled, and there it was, that subtle give, that 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension bit. His hands, caked in grease, ached from a 16-hour day, but he could feel that slack as if it were a canyon. It was wrong. A profound, deadly wrongness. The piano wire had come from a salvaged P-38, one that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. The airframe was scrap, destined for a metal graveyard, but McKenna had stripped it for parts, a vulture of necessity. He'd pocketed a 6-inch piece of high-tensile wire from its rudder trim system, not knowing why. Now he knew. He sat on the cool concrete of the hangar floor, the single piece of wire and a pair of pliers in his hands. He began to bend it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, resisting him, fighting his intention. His greasy hands slipped twice. On the second try, the sharp edge of the wire bit deep into his thumb. Blood, dark and slick in the dim light, welled up, making the wire slippery. He cursed under his breath, wiped his thumb on his coveralls, and kept working. It took him 8 minutes of focused, painful effort to get the shape just right. This small, crude Z would act as an inline tensioner, preloading the cable just enough to swallow the slack. Installation was a claustrophobic nightmare. The space inside the boom was tight, a maze of structure and wiring. He worked one-handed, holding a flashlight in his teeth, its beam dancing and creating monstrous, jumping shadows. The sharp edge of a metal frame cut into his shoulder. Sweat trickled down his spine. A cold river in the hot, still air. He fumbled to disconnect the cable at the pulley, his fingers thick and clumsy. The clevis pin, small and vital, slipped from his grasp. He heard it bounce, once, twice, then silence. A wave of cold panic washed over him. He spent 5 frantic minutes padding around in the dark, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The thought of what would happen if the engineering officer found him, unauthorized modification, flight control system tampering, was terrifying. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison. But then the image of Hayes's face, pale and haunted, flashed in his mind. He found the pin. With trembling hands, he inserted his piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley and reconnected it. The fit was tight, resistant. He had to force the clevis pin back through. When it finally clicked into place, a wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He tested it. He pulled on the cable. No give, no slack. It was solid. The control surface moved the instant he applied pressure. Perfect. He replaced the panel, cleaned his tools, and wiped the blood from his hand and the wire. It was 0111 fine hours. The tropical night was a wall of sound and humidity. In the distance, the faint, menacing drone of Japanese night raiders made his stomach clench. He had just committed a crime that could ruin him. If the modification failed, Hayes would die, and it would be his fault. But if it worked, Hayes might just live. McKenna walked to his bunk, but didn't sleep. He just stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the jungle, and waited for the dawn. The fight began at 0814. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s found 9 zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was a blinding glare behind them. A perfect setup. Hayes, flying number 3, heard his element leader call the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes locked onto a 0 at the rear of the enemy formation, his P-38, a silver arrow screaming downwards. 380, Mahatipya. The 0 swelled in his gun sight. He could see the red Hinomaru, the rising sun, on the fuselage. He could see the dark shape of the pilot's head in the canopy. He squeezed the trigger. The 450 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm cannon in the nose erupted in a deafening, hammering roar. Tracers arced out, a fiery hand reaching for the enemy. Most missed. A few rounds sparked harmlessly off the 0's wing. The Japanese pilot, alerted, snap-rolled right and dove. Here it was, the moment of truth. Hayes jammed his stick to the right to follow, and then he felt it. An electric shock. The airplane responded instantly. There was no lag, no mushiness, no feeling of fighting through mud. The stick moved, and the plane rolled. It was a revelation. He'd never felt his P-38 move like this. It was as if the aircraft had been awakened, finally unleashed. He completed a 90-degree roll in what felt like half the time, his nose slicing down. The 0 was still there, right in his sight picture. He fired again, a solid 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the 0's fuselage, from its tail to its cockpit. The engine blossomed into a ball of orange and black. Debris cartwheeled past his canopy. The enemy plane rolled onto its back and fell away, a funeral pyre trailing a thick plume of smoke toward the jungle. His first kill, but adrenaline banished any celebration. "Zeros on our 6!" his wingman screamed. Hayes looked up. 3 of them diving fast, hungry for revenge. Every fiber of his being, every word of his training, screamed at him to run, to dive, to use his speed. But doctrine was a death sentence. He shoved the throttles to the firewall, and then, in an act of pure newfound faith, he rolled hard left and pulled. The P-38, his clumsy, heavy beast, snapped around with the ferocity of a cornered cat. The nose ripped through the horizon. He saw the lead 0, its pilot caught completely off guard, not expecting such a violent, immediate reversal. The 0 was exposed. Hayes fired. The rounds tore into the 0's left wing root. The wing folded, crumpling like paper, and the plane tumbled out of the sky. 2 kills. The other 2 0's, stunned, tried to scissor with him, a classic tactic to force an overshoot. But Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, His P-38 was already there, snapping into the turn with a speed that felt supernatural. It was like flying a whole new aircraft. One of the Zeros made a mistake, bled too much speed in a turn. Hayes was on him in a heartbeat. Close range, 200 feet. He couldn't miss. The Zero simply came apart in a shower of metal. 3 kills. The last Zero broke and ran. Hayes let him go. Low on fuel, low on ammo, but vibrantly, unbelievably alive. The entire engagement had lasted 7 minutes. When he touched down at WWII at 0903, McKenna was there, a lone figure on the flight line, his face unreadable. Hayes shut down the engines, the sudden silence deafening. He climbed out, his hands shaking, his flight suit a second skin of cold sweat. He walked straight to McKenna, ignoring everyone else. He didn't need a debriefing. He didn't need to file a report. He looked the mechanic in the eye and said 2 words. It worked. What neither of them knew was that they had an audience. 6 other pilots, circling at 15,000 feet, had witnessed the whole thing. Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, had watched Hayes's element engage, and he'd seen something impossible. Hayes's P-38 was rolling faster than any Lightning he had ever seen. It snapped through maneuvers like a lightweight stunt plane. Mitchell was a veteran. He knew the pilots, he knew their planes. Hayes was a decent pilot, but he wasn't a prodigy. Something else was at play. After landing, Mitchell cornered Hayes in the debriefing room. The young lieutenant was still high on adrenaline, his hands trembling as he tried to fill out the combat report for 3 confirmed kills. "What was different, Hayes?" Mitchell asked, his voice low. Hayes, still dazed, just shook his head. "I don't know, sir. She just responded better today." Mitchell pressed. "Did maintenance do anything to your aircraft?" Hayes hesitated, then looked toward the flight line. "You should talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna." 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna working on another P-38, his hands in coveralls a map of grease and hydraulic fluid. Mitchell didn't waste time. "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. There was a long, silent moment of appraisal. Then McKenna told him everything: the slack, the piano wire, the Z-shape, the unauthorized, career-ending modification. Mitchell listened, his expression unchanging. When McKenna finished, the captain asked a simple question. "Can you do it to my plane?" McKenna laid out the risks. Unapproved, untested, a court-martial for both of them if it went wrong. Mitchell cut him off. "I've lost 4 pilots from my flight this month, Sergeant, all in turning fights. If this gives my men a better chance to survive, I'll take the risk. To hell with the regulations." That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. The next morning, Mitchell came back from a patrol, his voice electric over the radio, raving about the improvement. "She rolls like a fighter, not a damn truck," he told his wingman. Soon, the wingman wanted the modification. Then his element leader. By August 20th, a secret illegal upgrade program run by a single enlisted mechanic was underway. Word spread not through official channels, but in hushed whispers, pilot to pilot in the ready rooms, mechanic to mechanic on the flight line. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on the 22nd. Mitchell got 3 on the 25th. The kill-to-loss ratio began to shift. The modification, a ghost in the machine, was winning the war, 1 dogfight at a time. The change rippled outward. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Guisap, heard the rumor from a transfer pilot. Skeptical but desperate, he tried it on 1 plane. The pilot, who hadn't scored a single victory in 8 weeks, came back with his first kill. Watkins modified 4 more. The engineering officers were baffled. Cable tensions always checked out during formal inspections because the crew chiefs, now part of a silent conspiracy, would remove the tensioners beforehand and reinstall them right after. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. The brass remained blissfully ignorant. By September, the tide had turned. But it wasn't just the Americans who noticed. The Japanese noticed too. In the skies over New Guinea, a creeping uncertainty began to infect the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet grew laced with confusion and frustration. American P-38s, once predictable and clumsy in a turn, were suddenly fighting with a new, aggressive ferocity. They were rolling faster, reversing direction with shocking speed. Tactics that had been a guaranteed kill for months were now leading to stalemates, or worse, death. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sasai, one of Japan's most revered aces with 64 confirmed kills, felt this shift personally. He was a master of the sky, a man who had fought American pilots since the first day of the war. On September 3, 1943, over WWII, he engaged a P-38. He used his signature tactic: lure the American into a turn, wait for the heavy fighter to commit to its slow roll, then snap his own agile zero in the opposite direction, cutting inside the arc to bring his guns to bear. It was a maneuver he had executed dozens, if not hundreds, of times. But this time was different. As Sakai reversed, the P-38 reversed with him, instantly. The American plane rolled with a speed that defied everything Sakai knew about his enemy's aircraft. He barely avoided a head-on collision, the silver American fighter flashing past his canopy, its guns already tracking him. Sakai had to dive away, his heart pounding with a mixture of shock and anger. He returned to base deeply troubled. Other veteran Japanese pilots reported the same bewildering encounters. The Americans weren't using new tactics. Their aircraft, however, were responding with a speed that was fractional, but game-changing. It was just enough to disrupt the perfect timing, the rhythm of combat that the Zero pilots had mastered. Japanese intelligence scrambled for an answer. They pored over the wreckage of downed P-38s. They found nothing. The engines were the same. The armor, the wings, the armament, all identical to the planes they had been dominating for months. They were fighting a ghost. They couldn't see the change because it was a 6-inch piece of piano wire hidden deep inside a metal boom, a tiny, elegant solution that was invisible to the eye, but devastating in its effect. Even if they had found it, they might not have understood its significance. It wasn't a new engine or a superweapon. It was a simple correction of a simple flaw. And it was killing their best pilots. By mid-September, the psychological toll was immense. The Zero pilots, who for 2 years had flown with the supreme confidence of aerial knights, were beginning to doubt. Their primary advantage, their mastery of the turning fight, was evaporating. Hesitation replaced aggression. Caution replaced confidence. The sky, once their kingdom, was becoming a terrifyingly uncertain place. The Japanese command, seeing their losses mount, tried to adapt. They ordered pilots to use hit-and-run tactics against the P-38s, but that was playing the Americans' game. The Zero's strength was its agility. To fight like a P-38 was to cede its greatest advantage. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s. American losses in the same period were 22. The ratio had completely reversed. Finally, an order was given that signaled a monumental shift in the Pacific Air War. Japanese pilots were to avoid engaging P-38s unless they had a significant numerical advantage. The hunter had become the hunted. All because of a piece of piano wire that nobody was supposed to install. The secret couldn't last forever. In October 1943, a by-the-book maintenance inspector at WWII, frustrated by inconsistent cable tension readings, finally traced the discrepancy to the small, unauthorized pieces of wire. He wrote a report. The report landed on a series of desks, where it sat for 3 weeks while officers debated a confounding problem. They were faced with mass insubordination, a clear violation of regulations. Yet the results were undeniable. Squadrons using the McKenna modification had dramatically better kill ratios and higher survival rates. The question wasn't if it worked. The question was whether to court-martial the mechanics who saved lives or quietly canonize their sin. In November, Lockheed WWII sent an engineering team to New Guinea. They tested the modification, ran the numbers, and conducted flight tests. Their conclusion was blunt and slightly embarrassing. The modification was safe, effective, and should have been part of the original design. Lockheed quietly integrated a similar, professionally engineered tensioning system into the new P-38J models that began rolling off a production line in December. But for Technical Sergeant James McKenna, there was no official credit. No medal, no commendation, no mention in any report. His name vanished from the official story, his genius absorbed by the corporate and military machine. Robert Hayes, the young pilot who was supposed to die that August morning, survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions, became an ace with 11 kills, and returned to Iowa. He married his high school sweetheart, raised a family, and spent 37 years as a crop duster. But every year, on August 17th, he would pick up the phone and call a garage in Long Beach, California, to thank the man who saved his life. Captain Frank Mitchell also survived, becoming a squadron commander and a 16-kill ace. He stayed in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel. To every young officer he ever mentored, he told the story of McKenna's wire, a lesson that the most brilliant solutions often come from the hands of enlisted men who see the problems engineers miss. McKenna himself returned to California in 1946. He went back to working on cars, opening his own garage in Long Beach. For 42 years, he tuned engines and fixed transmissions. When people asked about the war, he'd just shrug. "I was a mechanic," he'd say. "Fixed airplanes, that's all." It wasn't until 1991 that a military historian, digging through old maintenance logs, found the first traces of the piano wire legend. He tracked down McKenna, then 73, still tinkering in his garage. McKenna confirmed the story with his characteristic humility, saying it was just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that this one simple, illegal fix may have saved the lives of nearly 100 American pilots. McKenna said he never kept count. He just remembered the faces of the ones who came back. That was enough. James McKenna passed away in 2006. His obituary noted his service as an aircraft mechanic in World War II. It did not mention that he broke the rules to save men's lives. It did not mention that his simple invention changed the course of the air war. His garage is still there, under a different owner. But hanging on the wall in the back office is a faded photograph. A young mechanic in greasy coveralls, standing proudly next to a P-38 Lightning. On the back, a date is scrawled, August 1943, New Guinea. This is how real innovation happens in the crucible of war, not in boardrooms or committees, but with sergeants and mechanics on the ground who see a problem, devise a solution, and refuse to wait for permission to do what is right. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day we upload fresh stories packed with thrills, suspense, and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button. This channel is for you, and the best is yet to come.